feel like a lot of people within Occupy felt really misrepresented by the media, and I think that's like a fair, criticism in a lot of cases. Yeah, I mean, I'm the mainstream media, right? And I heard that over and over and over again, and sometimes people wouldn't talk to me. I watched like some news anchor kind of get totally her shit handed to her and walking out of there basically in tears because it's not like it was sort of hostile to us because they felt like we're being portrayed as these kind of hippie, people without a message. All you say is we don't have a message. Well, here are our messages. Your problem is, you write with a pyramid structure newspaper story and you're not able to deal with the complexity of this thing, which is more than just one lead. The headline isn't easy here. And a lot of them were self-identified, citizen journalists. So, who saw themselves as sort of almost kind of Robin Hood figure, or so I think there was a lot of hostility. There were a couple ways, I dealt with that. One was, I honestly didn't carry a notebook with me a lot of the time. I obviously always identified myself as a reporter, but I took notes on my phone a lot because I stood out less. Because I would be standing there interviewing someone and then they would be people that would walk by and be don't talk to her, she's, whatever. Mainstream media, corporate media, Occupy the LA Times. They actually made a fake newspaper that was called Occupy the LA Times. It was pretty cool. Which is also actually became really useful, the note-taking on the BlackBerry, because if you're covering a protest, which there were more and more of, they would leave the camp, stage protests in the bank district or a foreclosure auction, and oftentimes there would be clashes with police and there would be running, and or it would be raining. I remember covering this thing in the Port of Los Angeles where it was a really misty morning and my notes were literally just bleeding. And I was all this stuff I just wrote down. So I just kind of tucked that away and just used my phone, which Dave Ripley is mad because I ended up kind of soaking my phone. But also awesome because if you've got your notes on your phone, you can cut and paste into a tweet, you've got an email, you can just feed your editor immediately without having to transcribe. I just think, and I'm faster at it anyway. So did that a lot. And yeah, it's an interesting question. It's sort of how do you gain trust for people?
Did it change over time? Did they get to trust you, or did they?
I think certain people did, and I think sort of Occupy realized that they could use the media in a good way. That we became actually sort of when there were clashes with police, and we weren't there. It wasn't going to be reported really. So I think it just depended on the person. I think a lot. But yeah, the other thing is, aside from stuff posted to YouTube, there was this constant generation of streaming. So when I realized that they were doing that they were actually recording all of their General Assembly meetings, every protest, somebody was walking around on most nights just with do you guys know about streaming? Yeah, so it's it's really fascinating. It's a whole new breed of person, a streamer, And Occupy LA had a bunch of them who would fashion these just really crazy, get their androids set up on this big thing and walk around and just be recording, and they would have battery packs so they could go for 12 hours.
And this is an example of one of Sky Adams.
Yeah, cross X-Bones, who's pretty prolific. He's out there all the time. And it's interesting. So he doesn't see himself as an occupier. He sees himself as a journalist. and he has written a code of ethics based off of like SPJ, like sort of using that language to have like his own code, and a lot of them like, you know, see themselves as sort of, I mean, it's an interesting thing because when you have like raw footage, when you have raw video, in a way it takes out sort of the like problems that a lot of people have with journalists, which is like that subjectivity that creeps in there all the time. So like I'd go home some nights that I didn't want to stay for the General Assembly and just like watch it, watch Occupy on my computer at home. And that's awesome to like know what's happening without having to really be there.
I had a question. I spent a lot of time in the Occupy camp in Riverside. It took a while for me to went over there to trust. And I was at the Port of Long Beach as well for the whole event because Occupy Riverside was out there. And what I was interested in what kind of conversation was there with the editors when it came to the camp getting evicted? Because I had numerous times where I was at protests for Occupy where I had cops giving me orders that I did not comply with. And I kind of felt like when I was watching the LA, I watched the raid that night when, you know, on TV. And I was completely offended by the way the LAPD said, if you want to report on this, then come over here, we'll hold your hand, and we'll walk you to this camp and we'll show you how we're clearing it. I don't think that that's journalism. And I want to know what kind of conversations you had in the newsroom and what role you played that night when the camp was cleared.
Yeah, so the negotiations were rejected. The mayor set a deadline for when the park was going to close. It was midnight on a Monday night, and said that any time after that point, the park would be cleared of people, and it wouldn't necessarily be when the park was closed. So that night, the park officially closed. They put up signage saying, "This is closed. This is what, you know, you risk arrest if you stay here." And then this weird, kind of creepy waiting period began, where it was like, when are the police going to bust in here? And there were like so many like fake, you know, people being like, "They're coming," and they weren't coming, and we would like all run down there. They wouldn't be there. And then like a couple days later, the LAPD sent out this, you know, alert to their regular media list saying, I think it was like at 5:30, and they said at 6 o'clock, anybody who wishes to cover the eviction of Occupy should come to our headquarters for a law, they didn't even say, just to get credentialed for how you're going to cover the protest. So we showed up there, and it was like, there were only like, I don't know, 15 journalists in the room because nobody had warning. And immediately you come in and they say, put your name on a slip of paper. They put it in a hat. And they were creating basically a pool. So it was like ridiculous. Nobody agreed to anything. And I was like, wait, I mean, you know, people were like, wait, didn't know what to do. I called my editor and said, because basically what they were going to do is they were going to have one photojournalist, or actually I think, yeah, one photojournalist, one radio journalist, one TV journalist, you know, basically creating their own pool. And so of course the question became, well, what about every other journalist who wants to cover this? And what does the pool mean? And, you know, there were just so many questions. So I called my editor and I was like, what the fuck, this is really weird. And he was like, just put your name in the hat. So I did, and I got picked. It's like, okay, whatever that means. So, yeah, so, and then the people who didn't were like super pissed and like, you know. So anyway, they were just like, make sure you, and I think actually it was, he had talked to our lawyer and she had said just like, really just, like, we'll work out the other stuff, but just try to be in that thing now. I mean, so what our strategy as a paper, and we're lucky because we had a ton of people and ended up marshaling, I don't know, how many reporters were out there that night? Probably.
Yeah, there were 20 maybe.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just assigned reporters, it was web producers, it was clerks, it was everyone. No, not everyone, many people, and they were all tweeting as it went on. So we were able to have our reporters were actually covering it, had a lot of help with feeds, basically social media and email feeds.
Yeah, so I was in the pool, and then we had other people that weren't. And the way it went down was...
What did it mean when you're in a pool?
Okay.
You're like embedded in these comps?
Well, you guys were embargoed theoretically, right? You weren't supposed to.
Again, that was never really like totally clear what the embargo meant. But yeah, we ended up sending out to, I think I sent to the AP and to Reuters and to my editor at the same time. So I would send every feed to those places. Yeah, so we just got a call. They were like, "It's time." Hot man. So we met at Dodger Stadium, which is where they were staging, and it was shocking. There were 1,400 LAPD officers that night. I mean, it's like since the riots, I don't think there's been this big of police action. So they had marshaled, city buses that were lined up, and the police chief was giving, not pep talks, but there was just this, and they were getting, riot gear distributed, and everybody had those plastic cuffs, and I mean, those images became really, such a symbol of Occupy, because we saw them over and over, like police and riot gear. It's so weird that that became just like a part of our, daily lives last year. But yeah, so I went there with the other journalists. We were given those guidelines. This is sort of how I think actually we created them on ourselves. The police were like, we don't care. So we created like some rules that I think everyone by the end of the night was kind of breaking. It was like such a shit show. But so we went with the police. We moved in.
Well, I don't understand why journalistic institutions would agree to be excluded unless they want a random lottery. And then I think it's suspicious that they would randomly choose the LA Times.
Yeah, did you see your name?
and then I find it really weird that the journalists going would create rules for themselves where they weren't allowed to disseminate information to the public. And I find it weird that there would be journalists at the staging location who wouldn't. You would think that there are 1,400 police staging at Dodger Stadium would be breaking news that your readers would be interested in. And I find, honestly, the entire thing, I'm getting very upset talking about it, but I think it's honestly really, really distressing. And I'm enormously bothered by the fact that all these media institutions would go along with something like this. And so I guess I'm just upset. Sorry.
Well, I get it, and I think we were all kind of like, this is just weird. I think, first of all, we were kind of like making it up as we went along, and it wasn't clear, and it wasn't like we signed something from the LAPD saying, we're embargoing this information, until, they arrive at City Hall or something like that. I know, it's a complicated thing. It's a weird thing. I mean, in terms of the not disseminating information, I don't think that's what happened. And I think it was like a typical pool kind of experience where you have, let's say 5 sets of eyes, or in this case it was like 10 people, I think. And they are sort of for this specific aspect of this larger action, because there were journalists everywhere else. But the viewpoint of the police, you couldn't have, right? I mean, I think it would have just been chaos to have
How can they
100 people there.
How can they pull people and run a public street? I got arrested covering the Occupy Miami eviction because I'm not part of the corporate media. And they deleted that footage and we recovered it. And you see all these other corporate journalists there. They're apparently, maybe they signed this agreement that, and I'm glad he told me this, because now I have some more evidence to go to ask these people when we go to trial. Who did you pick beforehand? before, and I apparently did not get picked, I got singled out because I'm not the guy who's embedded with these cops. Well, I have every right to be on the public street covering this event, because you can pull somebody in a courtroom. I can understand that, but how do you pull people on a public street?
That's a good point. I mean,
Because they kicked out all the uncredentialed journalists from the eviction.
Well, I don't-
Did you see the hat? I'm really serious about that.
yeah, no, I pulled it. Yeah. The hat was,
Yeah.
I swear it wasn't ripped. No. But, I mean, I guess, I know what you guys, no, and it's just weird, like, it was really weird the way it played out, and it's funny, we just had a legal session on Friday with our attorney, and she was like, please come to this, because the, like, landscape right now of, like, what journalists, you know, have the right to do, what their digital, like, note-taking devices, everything, like, it's all shifting, and so I think we're all kind of in this, like, period of not understanding that, and I think that in the Occupy situation where there were so many people who didn't have LAPD credentials but who viewed themselves as journalists, that was this constant tension, that, like, but that's sort of how it's always been, is that the people with LAPD credentials or with police credentials will be allowed past police lines on occasion when the police deem it safe or appropriate, and people who don't have those won't. So I don't think that was particularly different here. I mean, that doesn't mean it doesn't suck if you're trying to cover this thing and you were booted, but
Is it possible you got chosen because you had previous LAPD credentials?
I mean, they only, for the weird police pool, they only allowed credentialed people to even put their names in.
Because you have
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
they're obviously not gonna ban the LA Times, they're gonna have the LA Times covering this. You know what I mean? They're not gonna say, oh, sorry, you didn't make it, your name did not get picked, so we'll have the Ontario Bulletin cover, not you. They're gonna have the LAPD in there.
In my position, I wasn't part of that conversation while it was happening, and frankly, I haven't been part of it. If there has been a conversation after the fact, I'm not aware of it. I mean, I wasn't in it. I don't know, Kate, did we just sort of have a post-mortem talk about the issues?
I don't know. I mean, I think it just sort of like, yeah, we talked about how it just spoke to sort of how much the LAPD really wanted to kind of control the message. I think in the future, I don't know, we didn't really actually discuss like, going forward, how do you deal with this? It was a weird, unique situation.
Yeah, it's true. It's analogous to the military situation where, we have
That's something
to
really
pay
good.
the person.
Nationally, we as news institutions, I mean, just like you're saying, that is a slippery slope. And so I'm in the mainstream media, but I could also see how I'm like Kate, and you want to get the story, and you're thinking they haven't told you not to disseminate information, but it's like a well, if I disseminate it, I'm on a bus full of cops, and
Well, if I may just like explain really quickly kind of like how it went down in the end, because it was weird. So like we met at Dodger Stadium. At that point, it's like clear they're amassing for a major operation. At that point, we didn't write that. We didn't write that until the TV news helicopter saw what was going on at Dodger Stadium, reported that, and was like, well, it looks like the cops are really up to something tonight. And then it became clear that this was what was happening, and then we started writing it. But yeah, we chose to wait until somebody else had broken the embargo. I mean, and I must tell you, it was like 30 minutes. It was like, you got the call, and it was like, go to Dodger Stadium, and like, I wasn't even, at that point, I was like, kind of like getting a power bar and like running shoes instead of like this. And I wasn't even like, you're right, we waited. And then from there, we went to City Hall. We had 20, 30 reporters on the ground at the camp. And then I was with the police, with this pool of journalists. And so, yeah, when the police finally came in, all 1,400 of them, wearing these suits so they wouldn't get dirty because they thought that they were going to be that protesters would throw feces at them. So they wore these It was just like,
Wow.
so all the occupiers were like describing them as stormtroopers, which is kind of what they looked like. But so when the police came in, surrounded the camp, declared an unlawful assembly. At that point, yeah, anybody who, even credentialed journalists at that point, were told to get out of the camp proper. And most did, some didn't. I think actually, I don't think any credentialed journalists maybe stayed in there, but definitely a lot of citizen
Sorry.
It's Armageddon. But yeah, a lot of the credentialed journalists did leave. They again sounded their warning, you know, you're gonna get arrested. And then as the huge push, you know, there were like 400 people in the camp still at that point, and as the huge push of people came in, police came in, we were right there with them. And yeah, there were only 10 views, journalistic, or at least credentialed journalist views of what happened at that moment. And so I took that as a really serious responsibility. I mean, like, that became that kind of like, you know, when you realize this is like sort of a record that you've got here, and like you have to like think in those terms. Interestingly, I feel like where the news ended up happening was actually not like really within the main camp, and I think it was almost an LAPD tactic to get us so focused on that site and that camp and what was going on there, that as these protesters were pushed out onto the side streets and encountering, you know, the rest of the 1,400 officers, that's where skirmishes broke out. And
people a block away in any direction.
yeah, I mean, that's like truly where a lot of that kind of, I think, and there were fewer eyes there because we were all focused here. So I think on their part, that was like a strategy.
But you guys had a whole lot of other people surrounding the camp during the raid, right?
Yeah.
Did they encounter any police, I don't know, obstruction to cover what was going on?
I didn't hear about that per se. I mean, it wasn't like the DNC protest where we had one reporter take like, you know, 5 rubber bullets, and it was less, it wasn't, I mean, it was less of like warfare and more, or it wasn't like there weren't tools involved, and so I didn't hear of any of that. But I also don't feel like we captured that properly, and that has always really bothered me. I think if you ended up looking after, I mean, there were like nearly 300 arrests that night, and if you looked at like maybe, I don't know, two-thirds of them were people who refused to leave the park, and then there were also all of these other arrests. And to me, that is like what happened there. And there was footage of it that people took, and some of it looks pretty bad.
Did the way the message was managed by folks, did that ever become part of your coverage?
I mean, if we can be really real here, I did not like our story the next day. And part of it was, I was up until like, went home at like 7 a.m. that morning. And I was happy enough with like our online coverage because I felt like it was pretty straightforward. There wasn't a lot of like, there wasn't that push to spin it into like a front page story. It was just like what happened. And then I worked until maybe 9, and then I actually like went home and went to bed for like 2 or 3 hours. And then there were 2 other reporters, including our main LAPD reporter, you know, who had like a sit down with the police chief, and another reporter who was, I think, just kind of pulled it together, like a really nice writer, just kind of how we do a lot of big stories that we'll have, you know. And the story, which was like a huge front page story, and it had to be kind of forward looking because by that time it was really moldy news because it would have happened like a day and a half after the paper actually hit people's front steps. And it was really, you know, it lauded the police for this like new tactic. I don't know, you can check it out. The headline itself was like really, it just was a weird tone to me, honestly. And I I didn't feel like we really captured, as I said, sort of some of the like skirmishes that had evolved, that it wasn't this entirely peaceful thing. But that's my view.
I just want to say I really respect and appreciate your openness and your frankness.